All right, these are the notes for Westside High School carbon cycle. All right, so looking at 2022 data, it is currently April of 2025. When we look at climate change and where does carbon come from and human contributions, one of the ways we analyze that data is by sector. Where are we creating carbon? And the largest place that you'll find that we create carbon is in the transportation industry. So this could be shipping boats, this could be big rig trucks, this could be any number of things that have wheels and that move goods and services around. The next largest sector is our electrical sector, so anything that requires electricity. Industrial is like manufacture. Then we have residential and commercial, so think like your furnace, your stove, all of those kinds of things. And then agriculture is the last 10%. The problem with looking at it this way is, don't we use electricity when we do manufacturing? Don't we use electricity when we have electric cars or when we are at home? So electrical can get kind of put in those other sectors. So if we look at end-use electricity and we take electricity out as a separate category, what we end up with, most of the carbon comes from commercial and residential buildings. So running the lights or the air conditioners or the copy machines or the small appliances, stuff like that. 30% then comes from manufacture and industrial type applications. Transportation then is 29%, and agriculture is that last 10%. So when we start to think about solutions or how we change carbon, one of the things we need to think about is where it's going in order to make those solutions happen. What will be effective? So those end sectors are really ways we need to think about thinking of solutions. And so the other thing we need to keep in mind is that carbon isn't just some thing that's around. It actually has a cycle, and there are places that it goes into and out of the atmosphere. So sources are considered anything that puts carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Sinks, on the other hand, are things that take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So when we're talking about into the atmosphere, you can have things like volcanoes belch it out. Parts of the rock cycle will actually absorb carbon. Cellular respiration, so you know this one from biology. Anything that's alive goes through that process of cellular respiration, of changing sugar into energy and giving off carbon dioxide as a waste product. Decay of biomass, that is one that is listed as separate from cellular respiration. But anytime things decay, so think like your stinky trash is giving off methane, that's one of the ways that carbon gets into the atmosphere. And then, of course, burning of fossil fuels. So when we're talking about that transportation industry, we're talking about that electrical industry, this is what we're talking about. The thing about burning of those fossil fuels is 60% of that carbon stays in the atmosphere, and we're going to talk today about that part. Sinks are things that take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So the opposite of cellular respiration is photosynthesis, and so photosynthesis would be a sink. The rock cycle has another one here. Weathering of granite will also take that out of the atmosphere. If instead of allowing that biomass to decay, you bury it very deeply, that would take it out of the atmosphere. And then one of the ones we looked at in class was that dissolving in seawater. And also depositing sediments in the ocean. Those will stay in the ocean for this many years. So you got hundreds, thousands, millions, 100 million years. So once we can get it into the ocean, it'll stay there for quite a long time. The thing about a cycle, when we talk about cycles like this, is it's not circular. And so here's this graphic that kind of shows how it can move through the different places. So any arrow that goes up, that's a source. Any arrow that goes down, that's a sink. And as we start to look, that human piece with fossil fuels, you'll see I kind of put that little symbol around there. That's where we are when it comes to this process. And so then we need to think about time. One of our key driving questions was time. How fast is all of this happening? And so when we think about time scales, we're thinking about two differences of time scales. Hours, minutes, and days would be considered short time scales, and long time scales are like hundreds of thousands of years. So we would have photosynthesis, cellular respiration, volcanoes. Those all happen really quickly, right? We can watch those happen. Burning of fossil fuels doesn't take me any time. I put the gas in my car, I can burn it right away. Dissolving in seawater, we saw that one in class. That happens also very quickly. And decay of biomass. If you've ever left your trash sit for too long, you know how fast that happens, right? Things like sediments, we saw sediments, that data shows that it sits there for a long time, whether that's in the land or the ocean. And then the rock cycle also takes a long time. So then what you'll see is I classified these as either a source or a sink. If we start to look at whether it's a source or a sink, our sinks are photosynthesis, dissolving in seawater, sediments, and the rock cycle. Our sources are respiration, volcanoes, burning fossil fuels, decay of biomass, and the rock cycle. And then as you start to look at those colors, you'll notice that on short time scales, we have mostly blue in this time scale, or in this column. So what that means is it's easier to put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, right? So than it is to take it out. And then when we look at sinks, it is mostly long time scale. So the long time scales only, there's 2 out of the 3 are sinks. So it takes a long time to get carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And then once we start thinking about, okay, that's how it's moving, we also have to think about where does it go? Right? Where does it stay? Where does it hang out? And so as we look at this image, you'll notice you have arrows and you have boxes. Arrows represent fluxes. Fluxes are a fancy word for saying how it moves. And then the boxes are going to be, so any of the boxes are going to be storage spots. Okay? So if we start to, there we go. Storage spots are represented by boxes. I had that written down there. I should have just trusted myself there. So as we start to look at these, if we look at our storage spots, from largest to smallest, our biggest storage spot is that ocean, right? It's an easy place for carbon to go. It goes in there pretty quickly. The next biggest storage spot is fossil fuels. Vegetation and soils then is the third biggest. And while we talk about the atmosphere a lot, it's actually quite small in terms of our storage spots. So the last one then is in your sediments, okay? So when we think about storages, our ocean being our largest storage spot and sediment being our smallest storage spot, atmosphere is down here towards the bottom of the list. So when we're talking about our atmosphere, that's not a very big storage spot. And then if we look closer at these arrows, and we look at our sources versus our sink. Reminder, a source goes up and a sink goes down. If we look at these two numbers, which one wins? Well, photosynthesis wins. The uptake of carbon actually happens faster than cellular respiration. And if we look at the ocean exchange, the difference is this number. So notice that the sink actually wins, and that's by 2.2 gigatons per year. And then if you look here again, we have these two arrows are also partnered up. Ecosystem exchange and changing land use, the sink still wins. The only place we don't have a matching arrow and the only place we don't have that same process happening is in fossil fuels. When humans use fossil fuels, we put 6 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere every year. So 6 gigatons per year is how much we influence the carbon dioxide. And so when you're looking at the numbers, though, like 6 is not very big compared to 60 or 90, right? Like 6 doesn't seem like that so much. The problem is while human impact is small, climate change happens because humans leverage that carbon cycle to put more carbon into the air. So the carbon cycle favors a sink of carbon dioxide, so we should be getting less, but instead we're getting more. So when we start to think about solutions, taking carbon dioxide out of the air should be pretty easy. We could put it into the oceans. And when we looked at that in class, we saw the drawback was ocean acidification. We're going to have some ecological impacts when we change the acidity of our ocean. And so there's $1 million when you figure out how to get around that. Another one is by putting it into trees and plants. If we plant more trees, but those take a couple hundred years to grow. We got to try to get those going on as fast as we can. But growing more plants. So there's a nice little video here that you can watch about where do trees get their mass. That kind of explains that a little bit more. But we also need to focus on reducing those fossil fuels we burn. If we want to change how much humans are putting carbon dioxide into the air, we have to reduce the fossil fuels we burn. And so we could go to something like carbon neutral fuels, like biofuels. So we talked about ethanol, that was one of Nebraska's exports, because biofuels will then have the carbon dioxide that the plant takes up will be the same carbon dioxide that it puts back in. So it's carbon neutral because it's not adding any additional carbon. And that's if you were going on all biofuel. Now, if you're doing something like what we do in our cars right now, you're reducing your carbon footprint because you're using those biofuels. And then the other option is, of course, low or no carbon dioxide. If we're looking at alternative fuels that don't produce carbon dioxide, like wind and solar, if we can generate our electricity from that and then we charge our cars, that is where those ones would come in. But for a lot of people, that's just not feasible. The last piece is changing how we use electricity. We can avoid peak hours. When you charge or use your appliances during the peak of the day, when everyone's using everything, that requires more electrical generation. So here in Omaha, we have to add more coal to the fire, and that's going to create more carbon dioxide. If we can avoid peak hours, and so instead of making our energy usage graph look like that, and make it look more like this, okay, they don't have to use so much electricity, they don't have to use so much coal, and it can reduce our carbon footprint. So if you can avoid those peak hours, use your appliances overnight, that helps with that carbon dioxide. And then the last one is, of course, reducing our use. So in commercial and residential sectors, if we can reduce electricity as much as possible. So one way to do that is kind of the example we use in 305. We use those big windows because we don't need to turn on the lights. So if we can reduce our use and use natural light, then we don't have to burn that carbon dioxide at all. We can also, if we have to turn on lights, use LEDs. So if you can use LED lights, it uses much, much less electricity than other versions. And then maybe if you can't afford those, a little bit less expensive version are your CFLs. So compact fluorescents use more electricity than LEDs, but less than our worst option, which is incandescent lights. Those incandescent lights are the worst version of that. So if we can make those small changes, whether that is commercially or residentially, those are all ways we can reduce that carbon footprint. Okay, so solutions, when we start to look at solutions, we have to think about how does that carbon fit into both how electricity is used, as well as does it a source or a sink, and where is it being used from, and where can we make it go in that carbon cycle.